Right, so we're starting now. I'd like to introduce myself first and foremost. I'm Naomi Barnard, and I'm the Programme Manager for the Role UK programme at Advocates for International Development. This session is about the value of a network, which I think is possibly a little bit of a rather vague title for our session, and we're really looking at the value of a network approach to international pro bono legal technical assistance, specifically looking at some work in Sierra Leone. The Role UK programme is a rule of law programme. It is funded by the Department for International Development and managed by Advocates for International Development. We also have a broad consortium, including the International Senior Lawyers Project, who I think many of you might be familiar with already, iPro Bono, the Judicial Office, the Slin Foundation, the Bar Human Rights Committee, and the Inns of Court College of Advocacy. I think I've got all of those off the top of my head in the UK. And as I mentioned, we're a Department for International Development funded programme. So the Role UK programme really is a programme about trying to bring international legal technical assistance and utilising and capitalising and building on international legal pro bono work in developing contexts. We work with a broad sectoral range of people, including the judiciary in the UK, the bar associations, barristers, corporate law firms, legal academics, legal advisors, government lawyers. The range is quite broad. And today we're looking at that multidisciplinary approach to international pro bono work. So without further ado, because I have just spoken quite a lot, I'd like to introduce you to our panel today. We have Lloydette here to my immediate left, Jalaga and Rebecca, and I'll let them introduce themselves because they will do a much, much better job than I will. Great.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lloydette by Marrow, and I am a former Serious Fraud Office prosecutor. I left the Serious Fraud Office in the UK in 2017, and I now run my own small consultancy. I came to be introduced to the UK Sierra Leone Pro Bono Network because I was actually signed up to a Role UK mailing list, and I saw that there was a UK Sierra Leone Pro Bono Network, and I thought, how do I not know about this? Number one, I'm Sierra Leonean by birth, and I still have lots of family who live in Sierra Leone. So I then I identified who was the person who was speaking at this event, and it's a gentleman who's called Momo Toure, who is actually the network's country director. So I emailed him and I said, I'd love to know more about this network, I'd love to get involved. This was sort of around early 2017, and I was then connected to Richard Honey, who is the chair of the steering committee, and the rest is really history. I've been working now with the network for the last year and a half, and the work that I've been doing is primarily leading the anti-corruption strand of the work, so working directly with the Anti-Corruption Commission and the judiciary specifically on anti-corruption topics and issues. And one of the key things that we have done in the last year and a half would be that we have conducted 2 training missions to Sierra Leone. The first one was actually in February 2018. The second one was in September 2018. And we are about to conduct another mission in December of this year. I will talk to you a little bit later about the February trip, which was led by myself, and we took along a forensic accountant and a sit-in judge who helped to deliver training over the course of 4 days. So that's me, and I'll tell you a bit more about the activities that we undertook whilst we were there later.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure if my mic is working. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. My name is Jalaga King. I'm dual citizen of Sierra Leone and the United Kingdom. I'm also a dual qualified lawyer with practice and certificates in both jurisdictions. Not only do I practice as a lawyer, but I've been sitting as a part-time judge in England since 2000. And being a dual citizen, I've naturally had an interest in all things Sierra Leonean. And therefore, I've been involved in pro bono work in Sierra Leone since 2003. In 2012, a special interest group was set up by the Bar Council following a request from the then chairman of the Bar Association in Sierra Leone. And that ultimately then fed into the network because it was recognized that there was a need to coordinate a lot of the very disparate groups that were doing very valuable pro bono work in Sierra Leone. And what was happening from time to time was that there was a lot of duplication, and sometimes the wheel was being reinvented. And one of the things that the network hoped to achieve in trying to strengthen the rule of law and fostering access to justice was to make sure that that duplication was reduced as much as possible, and that the efforts of those who were putting in valuable work were targeted efficiently and fruitfully in the right direction. One of the benefits of that approach is that we are able to draw together very different people. From England, we have barristers, solicitors, judges, librarians, academics, and also part of the success of the network is because we have good relationships with local stakeholders and on the ground. We're able to approach our task in a way that allows us access to do the things that we need to do efficiently and quickly. And one of the examples of that in terms of a highlight was last year I was part of a team that went to train judges in the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal on ethics, and also part of that team was the former Lord Chancellor of the UK, together with Mr. Justice Blair and other senior judges, and it went down. It was very well received, and we've seen that some of the things that we spoke about are being put into action. So that's my introduction.
Thanks, Jalaga. I'm Rebecca Perlman. I'm not yet a Sierra Leonean citizen, but I'm working on it. I'm wearing two hats today. So I am the director of something called the African Commercial Law Foundation, and what that foundation seeks to do is use data and information to encourage best practice in the delivery of commercial law and justice across the African continent. I'm also a pro bono lawyer at Herbert Smith Freehills, where I lead our impact investment and international development work. As part of that, that includes our Fair Deal Sierra Leone initiative, which we've been running for about 8 years now, to support the government of Sierra Leone in international commercial contract negotiations. So this initiative started, it was the brainchild of one of our corporate partners who chose to use his 3-month sabbatical to travel to Sierra Leone and work on a pro bono basis. And while he was there, he kept coming across very, very badly drafted, badly negotiated agreements. Part of this is because post-Civil War, and I'm sure many of you will know about the dreadful Civil War that Sierra Leone suffered during the 1990s, you had huge interest from international investors in coming into the country in the 2000s. But the government didn't have the exposure or the capacity or the experience to properly negotiate those deals. So a lot of very bad deals were done. And what Gavin, this corporate partner from HSF, saw while he was there was an opportunity that we had to provide that same legal support that we deliver to our fee-paying clients, and I recognize some of them around the room, on a paid basis, but to deliver it to the government of Sierra Leone for free. And in doing so, try to level the playing field and create sort of redress the imbalance that they face at the negotiating table. So as I said, that was set up in 2010, 8 years ago. In that time, we've delivered around £6.5 million worth of free legal advice to the government. And that has taken a variety of shapes and forms. So a lot of the work is being done remotely, but we recognize that actually to have a real impact on the ground, we had to send our lawyers out there too. So we've been running a secondment program, which started in 2011. I was fortunate enough to be the third secondee that was out there in 2014. Unfortunately, 2014 was not the best year to be living in Sierra Leone, because that's when the Ebola crisis kicked off. When I did come back from Sierra Leone, I met with Richard Honey, who Jalaga and Lloydette have already mentioned, and we decided to formalise the UK Sierra Leone Pro Bono Network, which until that point had been a brilliant idea, but didn't have the structures and the formal process in place to really be up and running. So together with Jalaga, we set up a steering committee. We'll come on to talk a little bit more about what that process looks like. But I'm really proud to have been even just a small part in sort of growing the success of the network. And I think it's testament to saying that one firm can't do it all, even in just one country.
Great, thank you. So I think in those introductions you've heard both a little bit about each person and each speaker, but also about the work they've done in Sierra Leone. From the Role UK programme perspective, I think one of the things that's been very interesting for us as we have sort of been crossing or trying to bridge the divide or the gap between development and international legal pro bono is just seeing the variety of ways in which international legal pro bono technical assistance takes place. And the network approach has been something that we have been really, really interested in, and was something we're looking into further as part of our learning sort of output and work on our programme. And I was just sort of wondering, you know, you've got a financial crime specialist, corporate lawyer, barrister, and sort of already a multidisciplinary approach. And then you've also tackled a number of different thematic areas, technical areas, whether it's corporate law, the commercial law summit, the secondment program, working with judges and mentoring between lawyers, and also the anti-corruption work. And I just sort of wanted to sort of ask, you know, how do you approach this multidisciplinary, multi-thematic area work as a network, and then how does the network approach actually work?
So a little bit on the reasons why we decided it was necessary, and I won't spend too long on that because I know that Lloydette and Jalaga have given their views, but I think apart from bringing together various disciplines, which when you've got a focal point, for us it was a country, but it doesn't have to be a country, it could just be a particular legal issue that has various sort of strands attached to it, or that raises various issues, other issues. It's also about bringing together different personalities, because actually you need different personalities to make an initiative of this scale work. Having key people on board that were going to drive this thing forward in different ways has been absolutely fundamental. So we've mentioned Richard Honey. He has been a total force of nature in getting this thing up and running. And in making sure that we, as the steering committee, are put to good use and to good work. So we'll meet every quarter, we will discuss the strategy of the network, and we will also feed in our various strands, what we've been doing in our own various practice areas. What we also rely on quite heavily is our man on the ground in Freetown, Momo, who Lloydette mentioned. We knew that we needed to recruit someone to carry out that role. Relationships are important everywhere, but they're really, really important in Sierra Leone. And we would never be able to keep up the strong relationships that the steering committee already had if we didn't have someone there full-time on the ground. So recruiting Momo was fundamental. In order to do that, we needed funding, right? And as a network, we are an unincorporated association. We have no formal corporate identity, and we have no money. Enter Royal UK, which has been, you know, a phenomenal resource for us to be able to rely on. And fundamentally, our network would not have been a success without the funding that has allowed Momo to do his job.
I think that's absolutely right. And I also just add to that one of the advantages also is that a lot of people give up very valuable free time to help us. So you have sitting judges who help us by traveling and giving their time to training. You have court administrative staff, senior staff who do likewise. You have organizations like the International Advocacy Training Council, as it then was. It's now the Inns of Court Training Council. They provided training for local advocates free of charge to the network, and at their own expense, flying out trainers to go and train local practitioners. We had universities donating books. We had librarians going to the courts to assist in reorganizing the library systems and updating them in order to make them more efficient. And the advantage of having a single network is that when the need on the ground is brought to our attention, we're able to reach out to the right people who can help. And because we have those close relationships, we know whether something is already being done or whether indeed it's being done in the right way. Because what sometimes happens is that you may, for instance, get a clash in terms of jurisdiction. So that Sierra Leone is based on the English system, for instance, but it gets assistance not just from the UK but internationally. And the US also provides a lot of assistance, and sometimes the US system is not compatible with everything Sierra Leonean. And we're able to say, well, this approach actually needs to be modified because it's not relevant to the particular issues in this particular jurisdiction, which sometimes those who are providing the aid will not have that information, because very often the people on the ground sometimes don't actually have the time to study what's being offered, and will just see a donor come in and offering something and will take it without actually saying, well, actually, yes, in principle it's good, but actually, is it fit for purpose? Is it something that fits the laws and the rules of this particular jurisdiction? And so I think we've been able to add some value so far as that also is concerned.
Great. And just to sort of, I guess, following on both Rebecca and Jalaga, so Rebecca, you mentioned sort of the value of having that man on the ground as a regular sort of source of information and sort of coordination. And then Jalaga, you also mentioned the sort of broad range of support that comes from the UK legal sector and the UK legal pro bono sector and the energy from that side. It would be really useful to hear your views and reflections on how all of that is received, if that makes sense. So, you've got all of these very keen people from the UK side. So how does it work successfully in country, and how has, the network has been now very long standing. So, what has led to that success in Sierra Leone?
Well, I think a number of things have led to that success. I think, first of all, we were fortunate because obviously Rebecca and Herbert Smith were doing good work already from the government point of view. So we had that in place already. But as a new network going in and trying to coordinate pro bono work on the ground, we did initially encounter some apprehension and some suspicion. And so we had to spend a lot of time building up confidence in us and trust, because I guess there was a certain amount of donor fatigue in country and wariness that actually not all the work that was being done by donors was being done in good faith. And there was also a sense of, well, who are you to come and teach us what we've been doing for years? We're senior practitioners, we're judges in our own rights. Why do you think you can come and tell us better how to do it? And so we had to persuade them that actually that's not what we were about. We weren't there to impose a way of doing things on them. We were there to work with them. It was for them to come to us and say, look, these are the areas where we could use some help or some technical assistance. And over the years, that trust developed to the extent where now we don't actually need to go to them that often. They come to us and say, look, this is what we want to do. Can you help us?
Absolutely. I think also it's that, just to follow on from Jalaga's point about there needs to be a dialogue with the country that you're working in and the institutions that you're working with. One of the things that I think is really important from my experience of working in Sierra Leone is to approach those institutions and the individuals who work in those institutions with a degree of respect, and to recognize, I think as Jalaga said, that these are people who are professionals in their own right. They may be working in rather difficult circumstances and may not have all of the resources that we may have access to. But also I think part of the success is that as we go in and engage with them, that what we seek to do is introduce a dialogue. It's really about engaging and saying, well, actually, let's find out, this is how we do it in our jurisdiction. We want to know how you do it, and we want to see where there's room for improvement. We want to hear your experiences. And I think that really gives them empowers people, first of all, to say what is going on in their jurisdiction, the issues that they're having, but also to be willing to listen. Because we come willing to listen, and not simply to say, well, we know exactly what your problem is, we've pre-diagnosed it, we've got your solution, here it is. But I think also the key to it is also sustainability. We always have our eye on how can we develop relationships that last beyond an ACC commissioner or a chief justice or a president. It's about long-term relationships with those institutions and really building trust within those institutions.
And just picking up on that, I think that the two words that we often use to sort of describe the approach of the network is demand-led. We are fundamentally led by the demand of our clients on the ground. But picking up on the point that you said about long-term relationships, that's not just within the government or the Anti-Corruption Commission or any of the sort of entities that we're supporting, it's also within the donor community, because the benefit of having a network means that you can be joined up in the sort of programs that are already being run to support those beneficiaries. And what we've seen in the, gosh, how many years now? 6 years now that the network has been in some form or another established. There's been a lot of change within the donor community. We've seen people come and go. You've got short-term funding cycles, which is a major characteristic of how the donor community functions in the developing world. And there are initiatives that will come in and be a very, very focal point for the government, and then those will quickly end, and there's not much remaining. Whereas when you have a network approach and you're bringing in players that take that long-term view, you're able to provide support to your beneficiaries that they're not actually able to get from the donors, that are constantly shifting and changing their priorities. To be honest, at the political whim of in the UK, Whitehall.
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, as the Roll UK programme has learnt over the years, we're in a similar situation. So that sort of long-term element and sort of being there, I guess it would be really useful to understand, I guess, for the audience here as well, is that, what are the modalities of sustaining that? So, within, I think, thinking more sort of, I guess, very operationally, like how does it work to make sure that you can do the things that you are doing? What are the modalities of operations? Like, you've got your man on the ground, what does he do there?
What doesn't he do there?
How do you sustain those relationships?
Well, I'm sure Rebecca will add to it, but Momo Touré is a very valuable asset so far as we're concerned, because before he worked with us, he was somebody who worked in the justice sector anyway, and so he knew the way that international donors working in the justice sector operate. But more important than that, he has a network, and he's relentless in keeping up his contacts. So he has a direct line to all of the major players in country. So if he needs to see the Chief Justice, he doesn't need to make an appointment. He will just turn up and see him. And likewise with people like the Attorney General and the Anti-Corruption Commission. And he keeps in touch with them, and they keep in touch with him, and he then is a link to us, because he's constantly in touch with Richard Honey, who, as Rebecca has already mentioned, is a driving force. Because whatever is happening on the ground, you also need somebody with a drive this end, and because the steering committee is not meeting weekly or monthly, we have Richard, who on any given week will be sending us long emails with updates as to what has happened on the ground and what he's done and who he's met and what we need to do. So it's basically, you need everybody pulling together and working as a team.
And I think, again, this is, the role that Roll UK has played has also been really, really important, because we're all very much willing and able to give our time. But it's remarkably difficult for even pro bono lawyers within big firms to have pockets of funding for these sorts of initiatives. So having an entity like Roll UK that will support us, whether it's the sort of small-scale delivery of training that we do pretty regularly, through to the much more ambitious initiatives that we do, like the Commercial Law Summit that we hosted last year in Sierra Leone. That brought together 90 leaders from business, government, the judiciary, the diplomatic sector, development sector, to focus on the reform needs of the country. And that was, again, we really saw the benefits of having this network approach there, because Jalaga came in to talk about advocacy and to talk about areas around anti-bribery and corruption and the criminal focus. And then we had other lawyers that were looking at PPPs, that were looking at how we can raise standards more generally within the Sierra Leonean legal community. And out of that has come a variety of things that Roll UK has continued to support. So we, for the very first time this year, hosted our first reverse secondment from Sierra Leone. So we had a Sierra Leonean lawyer who was about 5 years qualified from the AG's office come and spend 3 months in our office in London and do a variety of seats there. That was very generously supported by Roll UK and was something that came directly out of the Commercial Law Summit as a recommendation for building capacity within the legal community in Sierra Leone.
Thanks. And I guess building on Rebecca's sort of description of this Commercial Law Summit, it'd be really great to hear from both Lloydette and Jalaga about some of your successes within your work with the network, not necessarily with Roll, just, in the network approach.
Well, inevitably, it does involve Roll anyway. And so I mentioned earlier on that I've actually been to Sierra Leone 3 times in the last 12 months. And my first visit to Sierra Leone was in November of 2017. Richard and I had been talking about me leading this piece of work, or leading this particular strand of work. And one of the first meetings I had was actually with you, Naomi, and I remember saying, well, if we're going to do anything with the ACC, we know that they want some help, is that somebody has to go there and talk to them and find out exactly what it is that they actually want and they need. And so Royal generously supported my trip to Sierra Leone on a scoping visit. And that visit was incredibly helpful. I remember speaking to the Director of Enforcement, or Director of Prosecutions, and he said, you know what, we've had lots of people come here and they've delivered training and they've gone home and we've had lots of good ideas, but you're the first person who's come and actually spoken to us and asked us what it is that we need and how we want it to be delivered. And that was quite surprising to me, because I thought that's something that's obvious, but obviously it's not as obvious as it should be. And he was really like, I'm pleased that you're here. I sat with him in his office. I spoke to the lawyers that were working with him. I sat with the Director of Investigations. I went to court and saw one of their trials in action. I spoke to the director himself. I spoke to the IT team. I spoke to the exhibits team. Just really got a feel for the organisation and what was going on. It was a short trip, so I can't tell you that at that trip I knew everything there was to know about the ACC. But me being there actually was the beginning of developing a relationship with the institution. And after that, I came back, wrote a comprehensive report, and started to build what will then become our training framework, which has continued to evolve every time we go back. And that led on to our first trip in February of this year. We took along a forensic accountant. So when we talk about this multidisciplinary approach, actually it's not just legal experts, but actually we've started to broaden that out. And we took along a forensic expert from a leading firm in the UK, and also a sitting judge from the Southern Circuit. And those two individuals came along. The forensic accountant specifically came along because we had, during our discussions with the investigative team, they had said, you know, we need some help with this. We don't have any forensic accountants on staff. We don't have the resources, but we would just like to know how we can start to think in this way. And so this forensic accountant came out, and we spent an entire day focusing specifically on utilising forensic investigation methods in complex cases. So that was a whole day. We went into some Excel spreadsheets, showed them how to actually use Excel to develop their investigations and lines of inquiries. And the response was amazing, because they were like, gosh, you know, we didn't know Excel could do all of these things. I sort of zoned out at most of the Excel. At the word Excel, I was like, oh, zone out. But it was incredible, because these investigators were very much like, we didn't even know we could do this. This saves us hours. And this was one person who came out and did this piece of training for, you know, a 6-hour day. We also, in that particular trip, had Judge Roger Chappell, who came along and delivered a session on judicial perspectives. So on how do you handle fraud and corruption cases, just some of the complexities and the difficulties, and really it was a very frank conversation. It wasn't about PowerPoint presentations. He was very much very casual. Let's just have a conversation. There were Supreme Court judges in the room, Court of Appeal judges, High Court judges, and again, it was really a sharing experience, and really to engage in discussion to see what we could pull out of them, and then to feed back into their thinking and into the way that they work. We then delivered some sessions on ethics and integrity, primarily to the more junior judges, electoral integrity as well. That was around the time when actually it was only a week before the elections, the presidential elections and the parliamentary elections were going to occur in Sierra Leone. So we did a specific thing on how the judiciary, as well as organisations like the ACC, could support the electoral process, but also to make sure that the pitfalls to that process, and make sure that they avoid those pitfalls. And then finally, we did specific work in relation to modern concepts of corruption, and focus specifically on the Anti-Corruption Act of 2008, which is their legislation. And that particular piece of work came out of a discussion with a Court of Appeal judge on my first trip, who said, do you know what? I think we're kind of behind the times on how corruption is defined in this day and age. And he talked about the Larceny Act and how to reconcile that with, you know, the Anti-Corruption Act of 2008. And said, we'd just like a discussion on how, you know, what the current thinking is out there, and how we can sort of use that in our deliberations and in our discussions. And again, we did something with the prosecutors on the prosecutorial strategies and how to use the Anti-Corruption Act, and thinking about things like money laundering. So at the very beginning, don't just think about a conviction, think about actually whether or not you can seize assets. You know, think about the types of charges or what you could put on your indictment that would enable you to have a successful conviction, but also then be able to go after the assets of those individuals. So it was a real intense, it was a 5-day visit, extremely intense, and it was very, very full and packed. But what we got out of that was more requests. In the midst of those conversations, oh, we really need this, we really need that. Actually, you've just raised something which you didn't even realize was an issue, and actually, can we deal with that when you're back in Freetown? Can you send someone to come and help us deal with this? And so what we're doing in December is just we're actually taking a police officer for the first time. A detective chief inspector from the Met Police is going to come out and help train our investigators on investigative strategies, resource management, thinking about how to build an investigation. Because one of the things that the Chief Justice said was, actually, you have to get the investigations right. If you don't get the investigations right, the prosecutions don't go very well. And so we're focusing on that now in our next mission in December.
Well, because we've been there so long, actually, we've seen success in multiple layers and at multiple levels. And it's one of the things that actually makes it worthwhile doing pro bono work. So from junior practitioners who've been trained in advocacy, who the next time you go back, you see the improvement, and they tell you how they're putting into practice the things they have learned, to the university, for instance, in Makeni, where we've been heavily invested in training students and lecturers and trying to develop schemes that allow them to exchange ideas and have student exchanges with universities in the UK, to the fast-track commercial courts, where we've invested again heavily in assisting them to set in place processes which actually have led to the fast-track commercial courts having a very good reputation and being held up as an example by UK judges as to how to do it properly. And it's not just a one-way thing, in the sense that the UK judges are saying, well, there are things that we can learn from what the fast-track commercial court is doing, in the same way that the fast-track commercial court is learning from us. And I'm sure Rebecca will want to touch on some of the things that have happened in terms of the contracts at the law officers department. So each time we go, we see the progress and we see the results of what has been, I guess, for many, a labor of love without expecting anything back. And when you see it coming back, it's what keeps you going, because there are still a lot of problems. It wouldn't be right to sit up here and say it's all plain sailing and that there are no problems. But one of the biggest successes is that what we're finding now is that it's the stakeholders on the ground who themselves are now starting to address those problems and saying, well, we can't allow this to continue. We need to find ways to prevent this from happening again. We need to find ways to ensure that the independence of the judiciary is strengthened and that the rule of law prevails, so that those who are disenfranchised and did not have access to justice have as much access to justice as those that have the means to get access to justice.
It definitely takes time, and it is a labour of love for sure. But I think, just touching on what we spoke about earlier with the sort of long-term approach, is that things that will look like a failure on a short-term focus can end up being a success over the longer term. So it makes me think of a project that we took on in 2013, which was to produce, at the government's request, a model form MOU that could be used across the ministries, departments and agencies. And we had a secondee there, Rich Woods, who's now a senior associate at the firm. And he produced a brilliant MOU with guidance on how to negotiate it and on all the different terms. And that sat on a shelf and gathered dust for 4 years actually. And no one used it. If we had been a regular donor-funded entity, that would have looked like a failure. Over a classic 3-term DFID-funded program, it would have looked like a failure. But because we don't have a sunset date on our initiative, because we are there for the longer term, when that was picked up by someone in the Ministry of Finance in 2017 and is now being used across all of the ministries, departments and agencies in the way that we thought it might in 2013, it's now a success, and we know about that success. So I think taking that longer-term view, which the network allows us to do, because we can all share the burden and share our learning and be joined up in our approach, and quite frankly, as it is a labour of love, keep each other going when we have those setbacks, and there are plenty of those setbacks. It does mean that things that are going to end up being a success, we're actually aware of, and we can watch those things grow.
Yeah, I think from I guess the development program perspective, with our funding timelines as they are, one of the things that is really exciting about the network approach to international legal pro bono technical assistance is about that strategic and sustainable and also partnership approach, working in that long-term basis. And so I guess on that note, and noting time as well, I wanted to sort of, before I break it out and get questions from the audience, I thought maybe, the interesting thing is that how can this model be replicated? I'm sure possibly there might be some questions around that. Could it be replicated? What's the recipe for success, and what's the recipe for replicating as far as you're concerned?
We are not the only successful network. I can spot Nick Patrick over there. In the UK, we have the UK Collaborative Plan for Pro Bono. That is a phenomenally successful network that was set up in order to initially just address the access to justice crisis that we still have in the UK, but primarily created by LASPO. That's another example of taking a network approach to one focal point, an issue that is sort of has one focal point that has multiple other issues attached to it and raised by it. I'm not going to steal Nick and other members' thunder, but that has been a brilliant approach that's brought together. I think we're now 45 firms from the UK to tackle one particular issue. And has resulted in not just sort of the sharing and learning on the technical side, but also in helping to build relationships. That means that where we're conflicted, so we can't take on a pro bono matter, or we just don't have capacity, I now have a huge network of peers that I can turn to say, will you take this pro bono client on? And out of 45, someone will say yes.
Chilaga, Lloydette, any views on...
In terms of rolling a similar network out in terms of other jurisdictions, I see no reason why it couldn't work. And in fact, I think it would be a good way to do it in very many jurisdictions. Because I'm sure many of the problems that we faced and the things that led us to set this group up apply equally in other areas where pro bono work is being done. One of the most frustrating things at the beginning was the constant reinvention of the wheel. That, a program would come in and spend 3-4 years doing something, it would close, and then immediately somebody else would be doing exactly the same thing. So I think in terms of how you would replicate it, I think you firstly need people who are committed this end to draw on the different donors who are prepared to do pro bono work in country. And you definitely need a team on the ground, people who are committed to that particular jurisdiction that you're wanting to target, who are prepared to embark on a labor of love, who are prepared to suffer the setbacks and the frustrations that invariably happen at the beginning. But of course, in the end, the initial pain is worth it for the gain that you get at the end.
Absolutely. And I think that in-country support is probably one of the most key tenets of our success. I have worked with Momo on every single one of my trips, and he's simply awesome. And I think every network needs several Momos probably. But the point is, it's someone who is able to navigate the social and political terrain in that country, but remain apolitical. Because the role that Momo Touré played after the transition from a newly elected government, a new administration, was absolutely critical. Because he wasn't politically aligned with anybody, he was able to then go in and see the new Attorney General and speak to the new ACC Commissioner and gain an audience with the Solicitor General and really bring what we were doing to their attention, and therefore enabled our work to really continue without hindrance. So that in-country support is really about making sure that whoever it is that does that is someone who can navigate any political party, any issues that may be going on, and just remain professional. when you see Momo in action, he is simply professional, courteous, totally on the ball, and just gets on with the job. And he truly is working so hard on a consistent basis for the success of the network. So I think that person is, or several of those types of individuals is really important for sustaining the work that we do and enabling us to be able to go back time and time again and build on those relationships and those long-term partnerships.
Yes, then maybe the better question is what's the recipe for a good Momo? I'll open up to questions if there are any questions on the floor. Yes, just at the back. If there are a few, I might take a few at the same time.
So you guys mentioned very much that the network was demand-led, but by now you'd probably have very deep insights on how NGOs could better rationalize resources and activities as well. That's actually quite sensitive to suggest, but is there a case where you guys are exercising some form of gentle leadership to kind of better focus efforts?
Well, we have a program of work that is quite comprehensive. And that program of work, I'm not actually a member of the steering committee, so I can't speak authoritatively on this. I've just been to a couple of their meetings. But from that program of work is informed, number one, by the demand, but also has been filled in. There have been some blanks that have been filled in as a result of our interactions in country, but also discussions here as to how we can best deliver what we do. So that program of work is continually under review by the steering committee to make sure that we are, our priorities are right for whatever circumstance we're in. Again, with the new government in place, our priorities remain unchanged, but we may have to shift how we deliver that. You may want to add to that.
I think we have a scope of work that covers a long-term, we have short-term projects, medium-term, and long-term. And we found at the beginning that we tended to overstretch ourselves and be over-ambitious. And so it was a bit of a steep learning curve that we had to learn that actually Rome wasn't built in a day. And so you've got to be realistic in terms of your targets and your objectives. And I think it involves a certain discipline. And what we try and do is work within that discipline. And so if somebody comes to us with something that fits in one of the existing projects, then we can work with that. If it's something that's totally new, then unless it's something that's very urgent and worthwhile, it will have to wait until we evaluate it and decide whether or not we can allocate the time and resources to it.
Absolutely.
I think we may have a pretty good sense by now of what's needed, but fundamentally we need buy-in for anything that we're going to do. So it makes me think of how the Commercial Law Summit came about, why we ended up holding that. It actually came out of a piece of work that arose during the Ebola crisis. So we were doing lots of emergency response work during the crisis that dealt with issues like key contractors saying that it was a force majeure situation and that they were going to terminate or suspend their operations, which is obviously not a great thing to happen during a huge public health crisis. So there was that work going on, but we were very conscious of the fact that there were going to be longer-term implications of the Ebola crisis, particularly for the economy. So as HSF as a firm, we partnered with Standard Chartered Bank and Prudential to develop an investor's guide to Sierra Leone, really to tackle that. I think the World Bank called it aversion behavior amongst investors. Pre-Ebola crisis and the commodities prices slump, you had a 20% GDP growth rate in Sierra Leone. That is phenomenal. And sadly, after the Ebola crisis, we were in negative numbers. So what we tried to do was to present a sort of private sector perspective on investing in Sierra Leone, a credible, independent perspective, and that actually didn't exist before then. While we were drafting that, we did come into some very awkward conversations with ministers where we were, as we're being independent and honest, saying that there was a various challenge in this sector, challenge in that sector. And the minister said, I don't want you to say that about my project, I don't want you to say that about my area. And we said, I'm really sorry, but we have to. This is independent, and this is from the private sector to the private sector. We managed to win them over. What was really interesting was after we published that guide, those same ministers came back to us and they said, okay, we've put the problems out there. Will you now help us address them? So we had a bit of a wish list, knowing what those challenges were. We had a wish list of what we thought were the right kinds of reforms that needed to be introduced in Sierra Leone to move those things forward. But being HSF, being based in the UK, even being plugged into a network that has contacts all over the ground, we needed that buy-in in country to make any of those projects, potential projects, reforms, a success. So that's why we went about holding this ambitious initiative, the Commercial Law Summit in country, to bring together key players from across different sectors and different spaces to give a sort of a non-partisan view of what was needed. And now we have that, we can actually go ahead and take forward the priority reform recommendations that came out of the summit. Do they look a lot like what we thought they would? Yes, but we now have that buy-in and we have the sort of the green light from the beneficiaries on the ground that we can make it happen.
Yeah, I think from a programmatic perspective, I think what is really exciting is that partnership working and the fact that, you are approaching your work as equals. So it's an equal partnership and it's sort of, again, demand-led. And then the other thing that's been really interesting from our side, from the programmatic perspective, is, the Sierra Leone Network has been going for so long now and they've had that program of work. And actually now, as you say, you've got the successes, you can turn around and go, oh, we did that. We said, there was a plan around working on anti-corruption or the commercial law, and then actually now we're able to monitor the value of all of the pro bono work that's gone in. And I think, we're thinking about the theme of PILnet this week, law for change, we can now see that change, and we're now able to monitor and measure how that change came about, and that's what's sort of very exciting from our side. Any other questions? Tumbleweed. Anything else? No? I wanted to, before we wrap up, and I'll ask for final words from all of our panellists, I would be very grateful, and the programme would be really grateful if you could fill out your happy sheets. It is a rather headachy part of all of these sort of sessions, but one of the things is we are a funded programme by the Department for International Development, and we are trying to understand how useful such conversations are around that sort of development law nexus. So it'd be really great to hear from you if you can take that time. But before we wrap up completely, I just wanted to see if any of the panellists final words on the value of the network approach. What has it been for you personally, and then more broadly, if you have,
For me, it's been incredibly rewarding. As I said, I'm a prosecutor and I'm a litigator, and that's what I've done my whole career. I've always had a passion for international development, and so the opportunity to do pro bono work in Sierra Leone was an opportunity to do something that was outside of my comfort zone, but in a relatively safe space, as it were, because I do know Sierra Leone, but I've never worked or practiced in that jurisdiction. And so it has been, I've been incredibly proud to go to Sierra Leone and deliver training and, and meet with these individuals and hopefully start to see some changes to, number one, how investigations are conducted, how prosecutions are prepared, etc. And it's been incredibly personally rewarding for me to be able to do that work in Sierra Leone as a Sierra Leonean. But it has also given me that, I guess it would be exposure to international development work that I wouldn't have ordinarily have had, and that opportunity to do international development work. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity, and I've really enjoyed the work that I've done there. It is, I probably pull on what Rebecca said about it being a labour of love. I now have my own small business, and so the time that we spend on pro bono work is incredibly precious, and it can be incredibly time-consuming, but it is work that, when I was in Sierra Leone in September, I met one of the judges. I didn't even recognize him, but he had been in the training course that we were in February, and he said, "Oh, you're back. Oh, it's great to see you. You've got to come back and do some more work for us." And I felt incredibly proud of that the work that we were doing in country was being recognized by those individuals who were actually doing doing the job on the ground every day. So I've personally benefited so much from being involved.
For me, I think the most rewarding thing is seeing the rule of law strengthened. We still have a long way to go, and when I say we, I speak as a country in terms of Sierra Leone, having a long way to go in terms of the rule of law. But I see that the effort that's been put into the country by a lot of people is worthwhile, and the results are now coming through. And I think perhaps one of the biggest lessons that the network has learned is that it always pays actually to be apolitical and non-partisan, and not to be close to the personalities You can be close to the institutions and work closely with the institutions. But we were lucky not to make the mistake of becoming heavily involved in personalities, because politics in Sierra Leone is very partisan. And so what you're now seeing with the change of government is that although the new government is committed to, they say, the rule of law and fighting corruption, there is a wholesale change of personnel in key positions, which potentially could undermine the very rule of law that the government is committed to strengthen. But I think because of the work that we have done and because of the fact that our focus has not been on personalities and has been on institutions, I'm sure that it's going to stand that test and that the challenges will be met.
Great. And Rebecca?
I think for me it's really just been about exposure to different approaches, not least the sort of monitoring and evaluation and impact measurement discipline that the development sector has to have, and that actually the private sector, certainly law firms, we don't have that same pressure to measure the impact of our initiatives. And seeing that through the network, seeing the sort of the M&E perspective that Roll UK brings to bear in our partnership with the network and Roll UK has meant that I've had exposure to issues that I'm now taking with me to my work on the ACLF and with my work at HSF to try to better measure the impact of the initiatives that we're running and improve the quality of the service that we're providing to our clients. So for me, it's been brilliant to be exposed to those different approaches, and probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for that network initiative.
Great, thank you. So I want to thank everyone on the panel. So thanks so much for your time, and it was such a great conversation. I love hearing about the network. But yeah, and hopefully it was interesting for you too, and thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.